Hi, my name is Jessica Nguyen. I am a second-generation Vietnamese person living in America. I am an artist, a musician, and I'm also an anti-imperialist liberationist organizer working with the local Vietnamese diaspora. I want to provide a bit of context about my family before talking about the organizing work that I pour my heart into and that my loved ones also pour their heart into in the area that we live in, and this is particularly for the localized contexts. There is a significant Vietnamese population. And my folks, my parents, were part of one of the wave of immigrants that decided to settle in Northern Virginia and were displaced from the war. I grew up and was raised in Northern Virginia my entire life, and I have mostly stayed in this area, and I think a really significant part of why I feel so tied and grounded to this area is because of the community that the Vietnamese diaspora has come here to build for themselves. And there is extensive context about this community in an oral history project called Echoes of Little Saigon Clarendon. I believe it was funded by the County of Arlington, and it talks a lot about how Vietnamese folks came over to Northern Virginia in the late 70s and 80s and settled there and created a new community of their home. And this was around the time that the Clarendon Metro was being built. So a lot of this property at that time was more affordable. And there were jewelers, there were restaurants, there were folks that formed bands and would perform on rooftops. And it was really beautiful. And I think that particularly in the context of the camaraderie of the trauma of facing war and needing a new physical space to preserve the culture of a people is something that is incredibly hard to come together to create. When the Clarendon Metro was finally built, long story short, it became too expensive for the Vietnamese community to sustain themselves there. So they did something that I believe is quite rare and really speaks to the resilience of the community, which is they got together and had a conversation about what to do next. And that decision is where a lot of them landed together in the next iteration of Little Saigon. So once Little Saigon, Clarendon disappeared because of the gentrification caused by the metro, these folks moved together again. And that is something that is incredibly difficult to organize a community to do. And we see that play out in the disappearance of DC Chinatown. Gentrification is such an insidious process because the implications of it really are going into the erasure of culture, and it is a constant uphill battle to fight for that preservation. So when the folks settled again in the city of Falls Church and came to what is now known as the Eden Center, they went through a second displacement. The first displacement was after the war, and the second was from Clarendon to Falls Church. Currently, I am the founder, one of the core founders, and one of the core organizers of an organization called Viet Place Collective, which came together quite recently, approximately 2 years ago, less than 2 years ago. And we came together in reaction to the redevelopment plan of the area around the Eden Center. And I will not dive into all of the jargon and what that means, but I will talk about what it implies. So essentially, there were red flags that were raised during the development plan, and one of them was that the aunties and the uncles and all the people that we love and grew up around in these businesses in Falls Church weren't really aware of the development that was happening. So we came together as a structure to, start knocking on doors and having conversations with folks and kind of just seeing what everyone understood about it. And the consensus was there was not sufficient outreach being done to our communities to help sustain them. And the question really was, these folks have been displaced twice already. What are the chances that they will survive another displacement? And the chances are low. So what is really at stake is a physical space, the last physical space that we have here, which is also the largest Vietnamese cultural center on the entire East Coast, and its existence. And when we got together to intervene and educate people about what that could potentially mean for our community, we were met with a lot of pushback, and we continue to be met with a lot of challenges. But we've also made really significant strides and have built such beautiful Vietnamese community, but also sub-communities out of that beautiful Vietnamese artist community. We have attended quite a few convenings in coalition and in community with other folks who are doing anti-gentrification work for Asian ethnic enclaves around the country. And we were even connected internationally in Boston last year to the first International Anti-Gentrification Studies Conference to happen in over 20 years. And we've made a lot of strides with that. But I think for me, when I process what it means to be an organizer, I think about the concept of sustainability, right? Like, what about organizing is sustainable for me, especially if this is a structure that we're all volunteering for, especially if this is a structure that can't financially sustain us? And my answer to that is being involved with the artistry of it. Without the creation of Viet Place Collective, there would not be the artist community, the local Vietnamese artist community that exists today. And that is definitely an effort that was communal. Something that we hear often from folks that have volunteered with us or have gotten involved at any capacity is that they've been searching a while for like some sort of platform or structure or organized community effort that they can see their identity and their wishes and their desires to hold on to their culture reflected. And I think that's what makes Viet Place Collective unique, is that we don't only celebrate what it means to be Vietnamese, and we don't only celebrate our culture, but we understand the urgency of what it means to lose that or not have a place for it to continue to blossom. And there's still folks from Vietnam immigrating over here. There's still folks who are looking for a place to land where there is community, where there are networks of support that work more effectively than what the government has to offer, right? And that is also such a crucial part of preserving our culture and why I organize with Viet Place Collective. It's really to create a network outside of a care network and a network of love and a network of support for each other outside of the mainstream and dominant networks that we are conditioned to believe work for everyone. And I mean to say that when I think about the culture of hyper-individualism that exists within the United States, we're taught and conditioned to believe that our success is our own success and it's not tied to the success of the people around us. But once we understand what that means for ourselves and we break out of what we're conditioned to believe, we see that structures of mutual aid or care networks for each other that we create are more resilient than fighting for ourselves and feeling like everything that we do isn't tied to everything happening around us. And I mean that in the spirit of collective liberation, and I mean that in the spirit of understanding that one people's freedom and liberation and right to live and not just survive but thrive is connected to everyone else's. I'm going to pause for a second because I want to think about the connection between my art and the art I am focused on creating within the context of who I am, my family, and what I aspire to do, what I aspire to be. And I want to start off by talking about how music and the music industry is a really, really challenging structure to work with, because, and I talk about this in the sense of the art world as well, because the art world is a giant, the music industry is a giant that really only deems art that is profitable as art that is successful. So when I interact with the artist communities around me, the artist communities that are particularly made up and created by people of color or people that come from displaced diasporas and communities, we see that the approach to art is not really centered on profitability. It's centered on having a mode of expression that is so incredibly tied to our survival and our perspective and our methods for processing our own histories and the world around us that we can't imagine ourselves separate from the art that we create. And that is not information that I knew, or that's not information that I grappled with when I began my practice as a musician and an artist. And it started out at a younger age. I was classically trained in piano when I was younger, and it's not really something that has stuck with me, but it is something that has foundationally structured discipline and practice. My first real experience of music that really moved me was when I was studying at university, and I joined my first band that was a rock and roll band that I played bass guitar for. And when I joined this band, it was during a really interesting era where there was the pandemic, where there was an incredible amount of xenophobia and misinformation and propaganda being circulated, when there was an incredible spike in anti-Asian sentiments. And that helped really ignite a movement across the country for Asian students in America to advocate for a better understanding of our history and more resources for us to all understand the history of xenophobia and anti-Asian sentiments in our country, and how it's also connected to the freedom of Indigenous and Black folks in our country as well. And that was really moving for me to be involved in, because that was the first time I became an organizer. I started off as a student organizer, and that was the time that I had a blossoming interest in understanding my history and being more involved with figuring out what I could do to move towards a dream of liberation for all of our people. And what that meant was not just learning, but a really hard process of unlearning as well. And that is something that I continue to practice and do in my role as a political educator today. So while that was happening, I was elected as president of the Asian American Student Union at my university. And essentially my job was to speak to the administration and reflect on the problems that encompass the entire Asian student body, which was a wild job to task one organization with, because there's such a wide array of experiences when you think about that population. And it was really hard, because when you work in structures of institutions, there's just so much racism baked into them. There's so much history of white supremacy baked into it. So you're not only working to fight against that, but you're also working to help educate folks who aren't willing to be educated about that history. So naturally, I became frustrated with that, and I don't think I would have survived spiritually during that time period if it weren't for my band. And when I joined my band, that was also the first time that I started writing music. And we were performing virtual gigs. We were performing by busking on the streets outside. And that was the first time that I really understood that there's so much power in musicianship, there's so much power in artistry if you're able to tie it to your story of yourself and your story of politicization. And of course, at the time, I wasn't able to grapple with all of that and understand how to cohesively tie in that the politicization with my artistry. But that's a practice that I bring with me now in the music that I create and the music I aim to create. I'm currently still in a couple of projects. I have continued to practice my craft as a performance artist and a musician that performs in the area after school. When I graduated, the band dispersed, and my experience as an organizer felt like it was missing something, because I was no longer organizing with my people. I was no longer in community with my people. And I took about a year to grow my political consciousness before jumping into the next project. And while I was growing my political consciousness after I had graduated, after I had put in all this effort organizing for an Asian American Studies program for the university, after I had put in all this effort with the organization I was with at the time, after we put in all the effort, to make sure that the next generation and the next iteration of Asian students at that university felt protected. I had really quickly realized that I didn't know enough to continue organizing as a political organizer. So I joined a community of folks in rural Virginia, which is where I went to school. And I was also in the poorest county in Virginia. And we created this mutual aid network and provided services like food delivery to folks. And it was actually a cafe. So we opened up a cafe together that was a community hub for political education and was also a music venue. And what we did is we built everything by ourselves. We built the stage, we built the bar, we painted the walls. It was very much a deep labor of love, a deep physical labor and emotional labor. And it was to make sure that we had these alternative resilient networks of communal care available to people who needed it most, because what these alternative networks offer is more immediate and direct response to what people need. And I would say that was a really transformative period in my life. I really took the time to continue unlearning a lot of the propaganda that I feel like I internalized when I was younger, taking a public education within America and being in public school my entire life, and kind of understanding how to implement my own personal framework for understanding and acknowledging biases in writing, specifically in writing when it comes to understanding history, or writing when it comes to understanding the media that we consume. And that is so particularly important for everyone to have an understanding of, because a lot of the media we consume now, especially on social media, is not a choice that we have. And once you're conscious of the kind of media that you are exposed to in your daily life, and how you choose to spend your time and what you spend your time doing, you become more aware of yourself as a person, you become more aware of the political landscape, and you become more aware of how your personal life is absolutely inextricable from the political. I really get tired as an organizer. It's hard to talk about gentrification. It's hard to go over history that encompasses mass violence and war and have it be at the forefront of all of our work. So what we do is we grapple with that by organizing in a way that is moving towards generative organizing rather than extractive organizing. So something that feeds our community and ourselves rather than takes from us. And that is a really delicate balance that we are trying to figure out right now, but it's absolutely crucial to sustain this work. I put my artistry at the forefront of my organizing, and what I mean by that is I help lead Viet Place Collective's creative efforts, and I get the privilege of working with so many different artists day in and day out. Artists who are typically second generation Vietnamese folks, who are typically Gen Z folks, who have this really compelling desire that is really renewing and refreshing to be around and invigorating. This desire to understand their lineage, where they come from, but also understand that because of the circumstances that we live under and the conditions that we live with under a culture of white supremacy and Christian hegemony and cis heteropatriarchy, all those things, that we are creating our own new culture as Vietnamese in America. And what Vietnamese creatives do to process that is so incredibly moving. And I will speak to one of the projects that we're currently working on and then talk a little bit more about the current project I'm working on as a musician. The current project that the creative folks are working on, this new generation of Vietnamese that are trying to make sense of and understand their identities and history of war for our families, is kind of an oral history project, but we're putting it into something called a zine, which is like a mini magazine. And essentially, because we work so closely with the folks and the business owners at the Eden Center, we want nothing more than to uplift their stories and their legacies. So what we're doing is we're essentially writing a book, a zine that talks about the history of migration of our people, and platforms the business owners' individual stories. And there is a strong focus on the Eden Center with this, but there's also a strong focus on the general area of Northern Virginia, where, as I mentioned earlier, many Vietnamese folks have settled. And we hope that it'll be a project that will not only help other people understand the rich history that exists and continues to exist with such resilience in the area, but also be a bridge of connection from the younger generation to the original. We call them the OG generation. From the younger generation to the OG generation, to help them understand why it's so important to us to preserve this history and help them understand what we think is at stake. Because our folks have consistently operated in survival mode. They don't think about what gentrification is. They don't think about what the impact of displacement is because they're dealing with it. They're directly in that situation of conflict. So it makes sense that they don't have the capacity to do the work to preserve the integrity of the structure and the strength of the structure that holds us all together. So that really is one of the goals of Viet Place Collective, is to step up and let them know that they have our support in doing that. And that's something I think about often in my music and the music I am currently writing and creating right now, especially when we situate it in the context of almost approaching 50 years since the end of the war. I am currently in the beginning stages of writing an EP with some people that are very close to me, and it is essentially a personal journal. It's going to be like the songs are essentially going to be a series of diary entries that are processing not just my experience as Vietnamese in America, but processing my family's experience coming here. And I'm very fortunate to have a community that I believe sees me for who I am in my most genuine form as an individual, because I do believe that that's not a privilege that many people have. So that goal is already fulfilled for me. And of course, that is another primary goal of the EP, is to have that part of my story and my family's story shared. But I think what I want more out of that is people who are Vietnamese or people who come from a displaced diaspora to understand that we are all collectively working towards the survival of all of us, and that we all deserve thriving conditions to exist together, and that it is possible. And I think that's what makes artwork revolutionary, is when you have this consciousness, you have this awareness of what are the root causes of suffering, right? When you're able to notice what the connection is between war and genocide and mass atrocity and trauma. Things that are so incredibly difficult to talk about and grapple on our own. Things that we absolutely and essentially need community to process together. And I think that's something that the Vietnamese community has difficulty doing along with other communities. It's hard to talk about. It's hard to bring up. And it's something that I have seen as a theme, not just amongst Vietnamese folks in America, but that I've witnessed with my recent trip to Vietnam a month ago after not going for about 12 years, that the history there is also so taboo and unspoken. And to me and my generation, it's so incredibly baffling that how can something as horrific as war occur to our people, something that we all experience together, and something that many of us haven't survived through. How can that happen without us coming together after to process it and understand it? And I think that the most engaging way, an easiest way to do that, well, I shouldn't use the term easy. Well, I'll stick with engaging. The most engaging way to do that and a really effective starting point is starting with artwork, starting with a community of artists and understanding how we all grapple with it. We need all kinds of artists. We need visual artists, we need musicians, we need folks who are able to make films and documentaries. And I have a lot of hope because I see that emerging with the Vietnamese diaspora now. There's documentaries coming out. There are people who are able to make a living off of their art as Vietnamese artists, particularly Vietnamese artists who are so connected with themselves and connected to the commitment of understanding our history, that are able to make this work and are able to finally create the conditions for a strong foundation for all of our people to heal together. And that essentially, although it is quite a lofty goal that will take more than a lifetime, that is essentially something that I want to work towards when I release my first album and my first EP. That's something that artists such as No No Boy have done. The New Wave documentary that was released recently has brought so many Vietnamese communities together. And yeah, I just see it play out in such beautiful ways in my local community that we really have no other choice than to hold on to this hope and to hold on to our artistry as something that won't save us in the sense that we're taught. Like, it's not something that's going to save us financially. It's not something that's going to sustain us monetarily, but it's something that is going to save the preservation of our people and our culture and our survival as individuals with each other.